Alex, hello. Can you introduce yourself to the audience watching our social impact track conversation? Go right ahead, Alex.
Hi, thanks, Kenton. Happy to be here. I'm super excited to be joining kind of the Boise crowd again. I'm tuning in from Washington, D.C. And so I spent most of my life growing up in Boise, and just excited to be having this conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI, if I'm not mistaken. Alex, I've heard about D and I, diversity and inclusion. What do these letters mean? What are these things? I don't know. Like for someone like me, I want to be good with these things. I want to be good with the people I work with. I want to be a good leader in my community. I felt bad just a second ago as we were chatting because I didn't know there was an E in there. and I guess for someone like me, what does this mean?
So diversity is really kind of, that head count for some organizations, but really it's leveraging our unique identities and bringing it to the table. There's not such thing as a diverse person. That person is their identity, and it only becomes a diversity of an environment when you have different people and different identities in that environment to create diversity, right? And so I cringe a little bit when I hear organizations say, oh, that diverse person. I'm like, well, maybe step it back and let's understand and unpack that. Whereas inclusion is really just a sense of belonging and making people feel valued for that identity, not, tolerating their identity, but being fully accepting of that identity and feeling like you can bring that to the table. Me in particular, I'm a queer, cis white woman, and that queer identity of being part of the LGBT community, there have been times, especially growing up in Idaho, and it's since been better, but growing up, I didn't have a whole lot of examples of what the positive implications of my identity could bring. I saw a lot of negative examples of how I can't bring my full self to the table, and oftentimes would shy away from kind of coming out to every person that I met, because that's really what the process can feel like. You're coming out each time. And I realized that there's so much benefit in being able to bring your full self and identity to life and to work in a ways that numbers can't even capture. For me, it changed my life. And so that for me is inclusion, of feeling like I can go into a room and I belong in that room. And I want everybody to feel that way. And that's why I'm in this work, to making sure that people feel like they can bring their full selves. Whereas equity, and I think equity is a newer term for folks because we haven't always talked about equity when it comes to diversity inclusion. You and I were talking about this before this meeting, where there's D and I, and then there's DEI, right. And those numbers those letters can even switch in the order too. But equity is especially new because as we think about equity, it's realizing that not everyone's coming in starting at the same place. Like, especially across racial disparities, there's folks that are kind of getting a head start with a lot of things. And to be able to unpack that in the diversity and inclusion conversation is really key, especially when we look at the events of today around the Black Lives Matter movement and the national spotlight on racial injustice. And for the first time, people are saying systemic racism and systemic inequity. Equity, making sure that people are getting what they need when they need it and having the equal outcomes, that is so core to making real change in this work. Equity gets to equality, but you can't have equality at the moment without addressing equity first.
We have a lot of people listening and watching right now, and many of them are either already entrepreneurs and business owners, large businesses, small businesses. Many are aspiring to be business owners and entrepreneurs. We have students with us in high school and college, and so for a leader, for an entrepreneur, what do they need to focus on with diversity, equity, and inclusion as they get their company started? Kind of in some of those startup mode. What do they need to be focusing on as they get it started and as they hopefully grow and scale?
As entrepreneurs are building out their organizations and as you're getting started in the workplace, it's so much easier to build with diversity, equity, inclusion in mind than try to retrofit an organization 5-10 years down the road and make it then inclusive and diverse and equitable. And so I think starting early with that frame of reference and just like prioritizing that with intentionality from the beginning is so key to this work. But I think one of the biggest challenges organizations run into when either as they're building out, rapidly scaling, is really a lack of process and structure. I think a lot of startups would be like, yes, like we just go, and you're kind of building, the plane as you're flying. And it's oftentimes kind of really a race against the clock, right? And so the need to slow down and realize that those processes and practices and programs that you have in place are directly going to either excel or impede your diversity, equity, inclusion efforts is really something that I would urge organizations to focus on. When I think about hiring and promoting, for instance, if you don't have processes in place around that, that's where the bias comes in. And that's where those decisions aren't going to be as equitable as possible because there's no process in place. There's no kind of North Star guiding people. And so I often hear, especially around diversity, when it comes to hiring or promoting, it's like, oh, well, we don't want to lower the bar for diversity, right? And when I hear that, I first hear, so then you don't think that there's a diverse makeup of people that can do the job really well. That's what I hear first. But then moving past that, I also help people understand that bar of lowering, where is that bar? Is it 6 feet? Is it 7 feet? Can you point to it for me? No, because it's in our minds and we've created that bar. But what we also know through many studies, tons of data at this point, there's endless data around diversity and inclusion, that bar moves up and down depending on one's identity in the room. And so if that bar is moving up, it generally means that that person is of a marginalized identity. And they suffer because that bar is keeping them at a higher goal to reach than otherwise other peers of potentially white majority that often do get these positions or do get these promotions. And so that bar fluctuates. And if we can have some processes and structure in place to mitigate these biases and bring us back to the table and saying, what are those competencies we're looking for? What are our values? What are we hiring for? Who can be a culture add versus just a culture fit? That's where we can actually advance diversity, equity, inclusion work. But until we have those processes in place, you're really just kind of shooting in the dark here of trying to figure out what makes most sense for your organization.
For an organization to have very healthy, good diversity, equity, and inclusion, is it just the CEO's job or the founder's job, or is it just HR's responsibility to push that? I mean, who contributes to an organization having good DEI?
Such a good question, and I think that's a question that I always get because when something's so ambiguous, it's hard to kind of say who owns this. And my answer is everyone in an organization. Everyone should be culture champions because everyone informs the workplace environment to those around them, right? If your coworker is making you feel like it's a hostile environment, then that person has just as much control over your career in that organization than the top leader, right? But with that in mind, I also think diversity, equity, inclusion has to be top down. I think if leadership is not bought into the process, then it's really going to be hard to make a lot of traction on diversity, equity, inclusion. Leaders really set the tone and they establish what is the company value and how are they going to hold themselves and those that report to them accountable. And I also think that middle managers is that kind of crowd in the middle that often gets overlooked. I think that's where, from doing a number of assessments from organizations, small startups all the way to 200,000 plus employees, middle managers are often forgotten because a lot of people get promoted into these people management roles without the proper resources, tools, training to effectively manage people and then also effectively manage people across difference.
If there's somebody who they just really want to get better at this kind of stuff, they want their company, they want the place where they work to be better, and maybe they are one of those middle managers, and so they have some authority, but they're not in that top position, and they don't have complete authority to make all the changes that they would want. What would you say are maybe the top one or two things that they could start with to start getting getting the ball rolling, I guess, on their company being better at that?
Yeah, I think one, I would say to a middle manager that it's okay if you don't have all the right answers. It's okay if you don't know everything or know the right way or have all the solutions in your back pocket of how to make this change happen. But you can still kind of raise the flag and say, hey, I think we need to be focused on this, and here's why. And I would say put pressure up to the top. I would say listen to your own team and hear what their needs are, and become such a great example of what a great manager could be in the organization that listens to its employees and prioritizes diversity and inclusion, that other people take notice. And they're like, hey, something's working for you and your team, and I want that for my team. What are you doing? And then that opens a conversation up. And if you can get more and more people having these conversations, leadership's going to have to listen at some point. And I think there's a lot of leaders out there that they've read the studies, they've heard the data, they know diversity and inclusion is important. I think we're seeing a lot less resistance than we've seen in the past around this. I think where the rub comes is, yes, this is important, totally agree, totally behind it, but how do I do it?
Right.
And I think equipping them with the how and the tools, and sometimes that means partnering with a strategic partner to do so, then they can make progress. But I don't think there's as much resistance to saying, hey, this matters.
With the spotlight nationally and even globally on racial justice, wow, these last few months and years in some ways have been just eye-opening, and I'll say, just speaking for myself, I've learned so much in these last few months. I've been kind of opened up to so many things that I want to do better at, and that I'm excited to try to be better with these things, and so with such a spotlight on racial injustice. In your experience, these last few months, has this made it easier for leaders and companies to jump in with a more robust DEI, processes and programs and framework? Has it made it harder? Like, what has this spotlight on racial justice done for organizations and diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think there's so many things I'm seeing in the space. I think a lot of organizations are waking up to what's really going on in the world right now. And, Black people continue to get murdered, and inequities are across the system. And the system was made to uphold the majority and keep white folks in a position of power. And it's really unpacking that and saying, I'm going to opt into these conversations, because as a white person myself, I could go through my entire life really not opting in, and there's maybe not that much that would happen to me from a negative standpoint, other than I'd be missing out on the diversity of folks and the friendships and coworker relationships that I could build. But ultimately, I've been able to tap out if I want to. And so for me, I got into this work back in 2015 because I was looking around me and saying, not enough people are choosing to opt in, are choosing to think about how this directly impacts them and indirectly impacts them. And I remember a similar national spotlight on the same things we're talking about today. We were following Ferguson. Black Lives Matter as an organization, as a movement, started back in 2013. And none of this is new. I think the national spotlight just chooses kind of what to spotlight at any given point. And it's promising that this time feels a little bit different. And I don't know if that's the pandemic, if people just had more time on their hands or what. But for me, I think that many more people are leaning into these conversations. And they're like you, where they want to create positive change. They want to advance this work, but they don't know how necessarily. And they also don't want to screw it up, right? And I think there's a fear that a lot of us have, saying, I don't want to make things worse, or I don't want to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And I think more and more leaders, especially in organizations, are saying, hey, I don't know all the answers. I have problems in my own organization and myself even that I'm working through, but I'm speaking up. And it's important I speak up because silence is a statement. And by being silent on this matter, you're telling your Black employees in your organization that you are okay with the status quo, that things are business as usual.
You know, with the pandemic, with the election coming, with obviously this has been a crazy year, you know, for everybody. And I think some people could, and I've felt this myself, you know, feeling like let's just work. Let's just put our head down, move forward. Let's work. Let's kind of be boring for a while. And here's my question, I guess. For some people that might say, I don't want to get into all of this with diversity, equity, inclusion. It's so political, and you know, if I even bring up this kind of stuff, like I know I might cause more harm than good, and I just want my team to work. And you know, we're trying to, we're struggling right now. We're trying to stay in business, and I can't deal with all of this. What would be your response to someone who's kind of thinking down that road?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go direct here because I think for me, I think it's so important to realize that if you tap out, again, it's from a place of privilege. And so I think that's something that we should all keep in mind. And I will also say that we all have different strengths and we all have different spheres of influence. And so I'm not saying to go out and change the world or boil the ocean. I'm saying find out what your strengths are and where you have influence and start there. If it's with your family, if it's with your friends, start there. You don't have to go run for president. You don't have to go, stir up things in your organization necessarily right away. But if you do have a place of power or sphere of influence, make sure that when you are coming to that, you're applying a diversity, equity, inclusion lens and making sure that you're uplifting everyone, including those that don't look like you.
Something you mentioned earlier that's going to stick with me from this conversation is, for people to be able to go to work and just be themselves. And whatever that might be, they whether that's how they're feeling emotionally in the moment, in that day, whether that's kind of who they are by the, however they identify themselves, just for whatever that means to them, for them to go to work knowing that they can fully be themselves and be accepted and be, feel like they belong and feel like they're respected. And I like that. I mean, that's the kind of place I want to create, that kind of a workplace. I want to work for that kind of a company that when people come there, like, they feel included. And I love it. I'm gonna hold on to that for today. But let me ask you one final question, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. What do you hope from this conversation here? Just 30 minutes. It's real quick, but as you're talking to students in high school and college, and you've got aspiring entrepreneurs who are listening today, and then you have business owners and people who are kind of at every level in between. For people here in Idaho, which is the majority of us watching and listening today, what is your final message? What do you hope sticks with people as we wrap up this conversation?
Yeah, definitely. And you said it, we could have this conversation, could go on hours, right? We're not going to accomplish too much in 30 minutes, but I would say that the one thing for me would be open up the conversation, start the conversations, but realize that the conversation is a starting point, not the ending point, right? That is just the start to the work. And to couple with that, define your why. Diversity, equity, inclusion impacts all of us, whether we know it or not. It's not just for some, it's for all of us. And so we have to understand what motivates us, what fuels us to do this work. Why do you show up to do this work? Why do you apply this lens to everything you do? Why do you use your influence in a way that amplifies the privilege of others, and amplifies those that don't typically have privilege? And understanding that for yourself and getting really strongly tied to that. I know my why, and I think if people got more in tune with that, then it becomes easier to do the work. But until you know what drives you, you might not feel as close to it. And so for me, I think that's what people can start with, is open the conversation up and find your why.
Awesome. Alex, this has been so fun, very informative. I love this conversation. And as a person who born and raised here in Idaho, and I know Idaho means a lot to you as well, for people who are really invested in our state being a place of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm just so glad that you are here helping us have this conversation. And for anybody out there, Alex, who says I need to talk to Alex more,
Yeah.
is there a website? Is there an email? What's the best way for people to get a hold of you if they'd like to ask you a few questions, or maybe have you point them towards some resources?
Yeah, so website, believe it's alexsuggs.com. It's relatively new, so you can find me on my website there. You can find me on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a great way to get in touch with me. And then also check out the firm I'm currently with, Collective, a DEI lab. They're doing really great work. And if your organization is actually looking for work, we'd love to partner with you and really help make meaningful change together.
Find your why. I love that, Alex. And hey, let's keep working hard so that Idaho and your company and our communities are places that are full of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Alex, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Kenton. Thanks, everybody.